Thank you for joining the webinar today. Did you know that you can catch up on all of the webinars by simply visiting Gasworld TV and selecting Watch on Demand? Most recently, HGV's Rob Cockrell sits down in conversation with Oliver Bishop from Shell Hydrogen. Catch up on the exclusive at Gasworld TV today. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Did you know that you can catch up on all of the webinars by simply visiting Gasworld TV and selecting Watch on Demand? Most recently, HGV's Rob Cockrell sits down in conversation with Oliver Bishop from Shell Hydrogen. Catch up on the exclusive at Gasworld TV today.
Hello and welcome to HGV Webinars, and what is hopefully your favourite forum for all your hydrogen discussion, insight and intelligence. And that's exactly what we'll be delivering today. I'm your host, Rob Cockerell, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Jørg Aarnes. When it comes to energy, DNV GL is an established and respected source of independent insight based on facts and data. The risk management and quality assurance company has almost 5,000 energy experts around the world, helping the sector to navigate and accelerate the energy transition. DNV GL provides advisory, certification and testing services throughout the energy value chain, supporting the sector's safety, integrity and performance from production through to end use. It works with some of the world's most innovative energy industry operators, government authorities, investors and industry associations, as well as large industrial energy users. Working across the oil and gas and power and renewables industries, DNV GL has a wide-ranging and yet deeply interconnected perspective on the hydrogen sector and acknowledges that society's transition to a less carbon-intensive energy mix is already a reality. In fact, DNV GL has published a number of reports already into the challenges and immense opportunities ahead in hydrogen, and its most recent report, titled Heading for Hydrogen, not only points to a more certain future for hydrogen, but suggests the time is right to begin its scale-up right now. Jørg, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show from the Hovik headquarters of DNV GL Oil and Gas in Norway. Let's start with that new report. Can you tell us what the headline findings were from the survey?
Hey Rob, and it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Our recent report, Heading for Hydrogen, builds on a survey of more than 1,000 professionals from the oil and gas industry. And it reveals that the hydrogen has really surged up the priority list for oil and gas companies today. 20%, or about 1/5, are currently actually investing into the hydrogen. And to this year, the amount that would be investing into hydrogen over the next year has increased from 20 to 40%. So the report really shows that the challenge around hydrogen is not in the ambition level of the oil and gas companies, but it's about changing the timeline from hydrogen being a prospect for the long-term future to something that we can do something about today or over the next decade or so. The report itself points to 4 very key enablers for that to be able to happen. It talks about the need to demonstrate the safety case. If you're adopting, for instance, the use of hydrogen for heating in buildings, you can't leave that decision to each individual or each individual house. You really need to find a common solution that works for all. And to that extent, you really need to demonstrate that hydrogen can be used as safely as natural gas is being used today. The second enabler that we're pointing to is a need to really develop the infrastructure. So that means both allowing for reuse of current assets and gas infrastructure, but also looking at where you'd like to develop new infrastructure to enable the industry and customers to use hydrogen. Finally, the third big enabler is that we need to scale CCS along with hydrogen. our forecast in the energy transition outlook, which is an outlook for the uptake of energy towards 2050, we are seeing a symbiotic development between the scaling of CCS and the scaling of hydrogen. And the reason for that I'll come back to later, but it's really about enabling blue hydrogen to serve as a decarbonization vector along with the use of so-called green hydrogen that is produced from renewables. And for all of that to happen, we need to have enabling policies. And that really needs to play out on multiple different fields, from the end use, as in the maritime industry, to looking at the carbon pricing mechanisms for CCS to scale. It needs to look at government initiatives to really roll out the industry and the infrastructure needed and so forth. So yes, we believe that hydrogen has come to a point where it can scale, but it needs to have a push from multiple angles for that to happen.
Sure. So both DNV GL more broadly, but also this new report, point to the need for scale up to begin in the here and now. But what we're saying here is it's how we scale hydrogen that's important, isn't it? We can't necessarily just go from grey to green.
No, you're right. I mean, when we talk about scale for a hydrogen economy, we're really talking about real scale. The hydrogen production today is a huge industry. We're producing or using some 2.5% of current energy use on producing hydrogen. And we're talking about scale, we really meaning that we can match that level over the next decade or more in order to use that as a decarbonization agent and using hydrogen as an energy vector. Today, most of the hydrogen is used as a feedstock in industry, and we're now saying that we would like to scale that with uses as a decarbonization vector. And that brings us to the point that almost all hydrogen produced today is produced from coal or gas with a very significant carbon footprint, close to 1 gigaton. Just a fraction of a percent of the hydrogen that is being produced today is produced from renewables. So that's something that we need to change. And yes, I think that both the oil and gas industry and a lot of other industries agree that the long-term ambition should be to have a fully renewable value chain for the production of hydrogen. But it would be sort of incorrect not to try to leverage the ability of the oil and gas industry to deliver hydrogen at real scale with the mechanisms and the value chains that you have available today with production from natural gas and retrofit that with CCS. The biggest sort of electrolyzers that you have today are at 10 megawatt scale, whereas the production from natural gas could easily be 100 times that and more. So the need to build on that capacity is fundamental to allow this hydrogen to scale over the next decade or so. And we also see that natural gas, which is projected to have a very dominant role to play in the world's energy system with more than 30% of the global energy supply in 2050, has a very sort of synergetic path towards providing energy needs in the future with hydrogen.
Sure. So if we accept that a mix of blue and green hydrogen will be required in the short term, is that going to place some demands on the CO2 capture technologies to get those in place to make blue hydrogen a reality? Will this create any challenges?
Well, yes, certainly it will put some demands on CO2 capture, but we should keep in mind that the CCS industry is not new per se. We've actually been doing CCS for about half a century now. We've all today have some 23 major projects around the world looking at doing large-scale CCS today. A couple of these are actually doing this for hydrogen production, including the Quest project in Alberta, Canada, and the Air Products project in the US. So we really know how to do the capture part. We need to bring down the cost, but we do know how to do the CCS part. But we do see that going forward, when I talked about scale, I talked about that you need to have a market for that hydrogen that you're producing as well. And in order to do that, you need to see CCS as a mechanism to deliver that hydrogen. And what we are forecasting is actually that the blue hydrogen will be the one to sort of scale the market rather than green hydrogen, because there's a need to sort of give some time to scale the green hydrogen production, and also because you really don't have an offtake of that without being able to reuse some of the natural gas infrastructure that you have in place around the world.
Now, we talked a bit about salt caverns on a recent webinar, and these are like fascinating future elements of the hydrogen value chain, but I understand you're not so sure that it will be economically viable, in the medium term at least, to produce hydrogen from surplus power, store it in these caverns, and then produce power again when needed. Why is that? And does that mean an offtake of green hydrogen is required somewhere along that value chain?
Yes, that's our opinion. I think that salt caverns is certainly the cheapest way of storing large volumes of hydrogen at scale today, if you have them available. Although today hydrogen storage in salt cavern is just done at a very few places in the world, so it's not something that has been scaled. But that's sort of the least part of the problem. If you're going to produce hydrogen from electricity and then use that hydrogen to produce electricity again, you're losing 2/3 of the electricity. In addition, that electricity needs to compete in the electricity market. And in that sense, it won't be competitive with the alternative generation technologies. So in the lack of having a market that you can deliver into, you will need to have an offtake where you can you have alternative uses of that hydrogen. In addition, you can't really assume that you can use only surplus power to produce that hydrogen, because to produce hydrogen from electricity, you need a certain number of load hours before that becomes a cost-effective solution. And they're all in DNV GL analysis points to that there are alternative uses of excess electricity, and hydrogen production is not the sort of first option there. So if you're producing hydrogen from electricity and you would like to do that to produce power again, you would need to compete with peak shaving technologies that sort of can cover the market there. And that's something that would overcover a few hundred hours perhaps of the year, which means that you have a very limited offtake of the hydrogen production for electricity production. So in absence of that type of offtake, the possibility of, let's say, injecting hydrogen into the natural gas stream is an attractive option, and is something that is certainly being looked into with quite some detail from DNV GL and the oil and gas industry as well.
Okay, while we're moving into the realms of infrastructure here, let's focus on that for a moment if we can. I know that DNV GL serves the oil and gas industry across around 36 countries. Something like 65% of offshore pipelines are designed and installed to DNV GL standards. So you've got a pretty good understanding on current oil and gas infrastructure. What's your take on how hydrogen ready our infrastructure is? Can we use or adapt a lot of that existing infrastructure for hydrogen, and what might that entail?
Yes, I would say it's possible, but it's something that you need to really consider from an end-to-end point of view. So there is a lot of countries around the world today that rely heavily on the natural gas infrastructure for delivery of natural gas, and it's possible to reuse some of that infrastructure for hydrogen production, or for hydrogen transmission. So let's say in the UK, what they've done is their assessment of the full sort of value chain from the hydrogen production down through the delivery of hydrogen to the houses. And they're saying that the polyethylene pipes that are used to distribute hydrogen into the houses can be reused, but that some of the transmission pipelines will need to be rebuilt. We are certainly involved in studies looking at possibilities for, rather than having 100% hydrogen transmission, you could also have blending of hydrogen into those pipelines. And that depends on the type of pipelines that you have, and also on the different components in the system. So one result might be that if you have a medium strength pipeline, then you might be able to accept up to 20% hydrogen by volume within a pressure range of up to 100 bars and 2, let's say, pressure cycles during a year. But if you have a high strength steel and pipelines, that might not be something that can be accommodated within the system. So then that means that you would need to look into those types of components. In addition, there are constraints on, for instance, compressors and end users, and you really need to do an end-to-end evaluation of that system. But we are working together with the major gas infrastructure companies in Europe and also in other parts of the world to develop guidance on what is needed and what needs to be done. And through that work, we're also developing a wiki that can assist in the scaling and reusing of the infrastructure.
Sure, that sounds great. So what do you think are the biggest barriers or hurdles to be overcome when it comes to hydrogen infrastructure?
The barriers, I think, is that it's difficult for individual companies necessarily to take that full investment. So it needs to have a government push to enable that to happen. And without having some, let's say, government initiative taking some responsibility for that, you'll have just bits and pieces that will be developed. There are companies out there that are looking at, for, let's say, producing hydrogen and using that for steel production, involving transport of hydrogen over hundreds of kilometers. And they're not then faced with the challenge that instead of being able to use an existing infrastructure, they might need to actually develop that infrastructure. And in addition to just transporting the hydrogen, they might need to also find a solution for transporting the CO2 and storing the CO2. So if you put all these things together, you'll see that it's sort of a system that needs to be put in place, and it's a complex picture. And you need to be able to incentivize that the hurdles for investment and let's say the predictability of that system is not something that is put as a burden on each developer, but it's something that the government takes a very sort of strong role in. So that's at least one of the major hurdles that I see from my perspective.
Absolutely, and you've alluded to my next question there, Jørg. Do we need to incentivize the value chain somehow through strong policy and government commitment? Do you think we need to do that?
Yes, and I can say yes, but it's not just a simple question, a simple answer to that either. And I think it depends on the use. It depends on where you are in the value chain. Right now, solar and wind has become cost effective and producing low cost hydrogen as well. But if you're going to sort of go only the green hydrogen route, then you need to have a storage system in place, right? So you need mechanisms to be able to cater for that, even if it's salt caverns or it's other solutions. In the maritime industry, it's quite clear that hydrogen ships will not be cost-effective or economic from a business point of view for the next 10 years. So again, you will need to have incentives to be able to materialize that. And that could be through initial governmental funding, or it could be through other mechanisms. And also to reach out to the CCS part of things. I mean, the reason you capture CO2 is generally because it's less costly to capture than to emit it. But today's carbon price, that's not the case. So policies, again, needs to make a level playing field so that the decisions with regards to what would be the let's say, most cost-effective options favor the ones that allow for decarbonization.
And do you think there are any encouraging signs that we're getting to that level playing field, that those incentives are on the way?
Definitely. We're seeing, first of all, hydrogen has not just sort of surged up the priority list for oil and gas companies, but it has also surged up the priority list for many policymakers, not least the European hydrogen strategy, which has a quite ambitious targets for how much electrolysis capacity they would like to have in even 2024 and 2030. So if you believe those targets, we're looking at having as much electrolyzer capacity in Europe in 2030 as you have hydrogen production capacity from natural gas in Europe today. So there's certainly an incentive there. But in addition, I think we're seeing lots of signs with regards to, let's say, carbon price initiatives that can help scale CCS. In the US, you have the famous what's called the 45Q, which is a tax incentive that allows CCS developers to attain tax credits up to $50 per ton if they are deploying CCS. You have incentives in California that can allow CCS developers to get up to $200 per ton under current prices. So there are mechanisms that are being put in place there to enable the scaling of CCS. And if you're looking at the new developments of CCS projects, a very dominant fraction of new projects are actually coming up in the US as well. So these things are playing into that picture. Not to say that there are a lot of projects also in the UK, for instance, that are driven more by government, let's say, stimuli through direct incentives. But if I could have a sort of a shout out to the policymakers, I think it's important to have clarity on priorities. And I think in some cases there is a focus on saying that what they would like to see, but not, let's say, that have a priority on what should be the pathway to get there. And that's something that I think we need to have more sort of clarity on, and ensuring that the policies are not just covering one piece of the puzzle, but also covering the whole sort of range of steps that are needed to get there. And that could bring me back to the enablers that I talked about, let's say demonstrating the safety case. That is certainly also an instrument.
And just while we're on this topic, Jørg, do you think we can incentivize the policymakers themselves? I mean, they're under a lot of pressure from us to make this happen and to incentivize the movement. But should we approach it differently? Do we need to get behind them?
That's a good question. I think there's, from a policymaker perspective, there's always trade-offs in terms of what are the priorities from the country, and the climate change is one of them, but health and schools and others are also important priorities. So we need to see the full picture there, and see how hydrogen can, well, in this case, hydrogen can help be part of let's say, a total policy mix that makes sense for the country and region. And what I guess I see is that in many cases it will be, but it will be different. And let's say parts of the hydrogen sort of economy that will be relevant for the different countries. So if I could use Norway as an example, Norway is a country with, let's say, abundant renewable electricity. So we sort of have a clean pathway to produce hydrogen. So that might be an important thing for us. But the incentive in Europe is to try to perhaps use hydrogen as a way of balancing variable renewables, because variable renewables has an intermittent nature, which is not so much an issue for Norway. So again, those two things are two different things, and I think we need to look at, let's say, country and region specific policies that will help develop and scale hydrogen within the constraints that are sensible.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's enough on policy for a moment. So just time for one more question. If you could leave our viewers and listeners with just one more message, what would that be?
I guess hydrogen has immense potential to be a very important carrier. What I would like to let's point out is that it's important to leave flexibility, not to be at this point in time adamant about choosing one particular solution over the other and leaving other options out. So while we're saying that we would like to have a value chain based on renewables in the future, we do recognize that to get there, we might also need to deploy other solutions. And I guess I would like to also reiterate what we see as the 4 key enablers: demonstrate the safety case, support building the infrastructure, help scale CCS to enable large-scale hydrogen production to become an important vector in the decarbonization efforts, and also then to allow policy to play their role in that fashion.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Jørg. Thanks so much for your time today. I'm sure our viewers enjoyed those insights just as much as we did here. And it's been great to get some more detail on that new report and really drill down into its findings. I think it's particularly interesting to reappraise the many different strands that will be required as part of scale-up, from CCS for blue hydrogen to the hydrogen infrastructure itself, and of course, those policymakers that will underpin all of this. And that concludes our webinar, and we thank you for your time and attention over the last 30 minutes, wherever you are in the world. For all of our webinars and interviews with key stakeholders, online, on demand, and for free, visit Gasworld TV. Until next time, goodbye.